One Saturday morning when I was 2 years old, I woke up hungrier than I had ever been. Down the hall, I could hear my parents snoring off their hangover. They wouldn't be up until past noon at least. I vaguely remember climbing over my half-collapsed baby gate and waddling down the hallway to the kitchen. I twisted the little black knobs on the stove just like my parents did, but no scrambled eggs appeared. Instead, the stove made a mean hissing noise and the kitchen filled with a nasty smell that I didn't like at all. The smell kept getting worse and worse, and I had a feeling that I would get into the worst trouble of my life if my parents found out. I went back to my room to play with my blocks, hoping that the problem would just magically go away. 5 minutes later, there was a loud knock on the door. My parents grumbled all those 4-letter words that they had told me never to say, and then I heard my mother sniffing. She said the house smelled like gas, whatever that meant. My father staggered out of the bedroom with his jeans and shirt half on, and yelped when he made it to the kitchen. Windows and doors flew open. I crept downstairs to see what was going on. "How'd you know?" my father said breathlessly to the shadowy figure on our front doorstep. "No." The kindly female voice sounded confused. "Know what? I'm Eliza Mortimer from the end of the block. I was just dropping off these cookies that I baked to welcome you to the neighborhood." Coincidence or not, Eliza Mortimer had saved all of our lives, and not for the last time. 2 years later came the first of many plate-shattering, furniture-breaking screaming matches between my parents. I was crouched down in the closet with my hands pressed over my ears, but the sharp knock sounded as loud as somebody rapping on my own skull. I tiptoed out of hiding and I opened the door. "Hello, young man. I'm Eliza Mortimer from the end of the block. I'm in a bit of a pickle and I could use your help." The woman on the doorstep was short and stocky, with frizzy brown hair, bright green eyes, and round-framed glasses. She wore an old-fashioned black dress with a wide belt and stood with one hand on her hip. In the other, she held a small red notebook. I had never seen her before, but for some reason, I knew her voice. "Okay," I smiled. Behind me, the battle had stopped. I felt my father's damp hand on my shoulder. He had been washing the blood off his knuckles. "If it isn't our favorite neighbor," he sneered. "What can we do for ya?" "Well, I started a new recipe before I noticed that I was all out of sugar. Could I borrow a few cups?" My father sighed and nodded. "Sugar," he grumbled as I followed him into the broken battlefield of our kitchen. Who the heck borrows sugar at 10 p.m. on a work night? My father shoved a wrinkled bag of rock-hard sugar into my hand. "Tell her she can keep it." "Oh, this ought to be more than enough. Give your parents my thanks, Ethan." As I waved goodbye, it occurred to me that I had never told our odd neighbor my name. Miss Mortimer came by a lot over the next 5 years, always with a good excuse. A missing cat, duct tape for her garden hose. One time, she even wanted help with a crossword puzzle. She didn't always arrive in time to stop my parents from getting violent, but she always showed up before anybody got seriously hurt. I didn't know how she did what she did, but by the time that I was 7 years old, I loved her for it. I wanted to spend more time with her, but my parents wouldn't hear of it. "Nothing good can come of a kid hanging around strangers," my father said darkly. Although, as I would soon learn, he had been spending quite a lot of time around strangers himself. My mother's response to discovering his extramarital affair was downing a cocktail of pills with a vodka martini. No matter how much I shook her, she wouldn't wake. And if Miss Mortimer hadn't just happened to have been out for a walk when I ran crying into the street, she probably wouldn't have survived. With my mother in the hospital and my father off with his mistress, it was Miss Mortimer who took care of me. I wish you could stay here forever, I told her that night, as I sat in bed sipping her hot soup, instead of them. That would be lovely, dear, Miss Mortimer replied, but I can't. Perhaps, though, there's a way that we can keep in touch. Would you like that? Miss Mortimer walked over to the inside of my bedroom door, bent down and drew a small chalk circle with a series of odd symbols around it. White marks that looked like letters but weren't. She gently pushed the door closed. Now, Miss Mortimer grinned mischievously. Put your hand inside that circle and open the door at the same time. I did as I was told. Instead of the drab hallway that I was used to, my bedroom door suddenly opened to a cozy room filled with bookshelves, well cared for plants, and an enormous antique desk lit by a single brass lamp. I tried again several times, always with the same result. Then when I removed my hand from the circle and opened the door, the hallway was back. That room you saw as my study, in my house at the end of the street. Miss Mortimer smiled. Now, if you ever need anything or even just to talk, you know where to find me. But how? I couldn't even say it. See these symbols around the circle? You must never remove or change them in any way. If one should happen to get smudged, let me know right away. And do not use the circle until I fix it, no matter what. Understand? I nodded. I thought I did. Good. Now get some sleep. Your mother and father will be home in the morning, and they'll need all the help that you can give them. Miss Mortimer wasn't wrong. Both my parents eventually came home, but they refused to speak to each other or take care of the house. Dirty dishes and overflowing trash bags piled up like monuments to the disgust that they felt for each other. They mostly ignored me. I was just another bitter reminder of the lives that they could have had. And honestly, that suited me just fine. I stayed out of the house as much as possible, reading in the local library, playing in the cul-de-sac with other neighborhood kids until the streetlights came on, and visiting Miss Mortimer. For the next 2 years, anytime I had a question or needed to talk to an adult, I just put my hand on the strange circle and stepped into Miss Mortimer's study. She was always ready to feed me something delicious, listen to my problems, or even just give me a clean space to draw. As far as I was concerned, stretching out on her big Turkish carpet with my sketch pad and a cup of tea was the best feeling in the world. With my trusty crayon in hand, I tried to recreate the unsettling images that I found in Miss Mortimer's old books. Women with mouths in the back of their heads, men transforming into hyenas, children with a single eye in the middle of their foreheads. While I talked and sketched, Miss Mortimer would stir the black cast iron pot that was always burbling on her hot plate, or take notes in her little red notebook. The cozy little room was my home away from home, the one place that I felt safe, until suddenly it wasn't. Just like on most afternoons, I had tossed off my backpack and opened my bedroom door with one hand in Miss Mortimer's chalk circle, eager to tell her about my day, but the study was empty. The little brass lamp was turned off, the hot plate was cold, and Miss Mortimer's favorite teapot lay shattered on the Turkish carpet. Something terrible had happened and I could feel it. Before I could investigate further, however, I glanced through the open door behind me and saw a sight that frightened me more than any of the monsters in Miss Mortimer's old books. My mother was rooting around in my bedroom. "Where'd you come from?" she slurred, when I appeared suddenly behind the door. "What are you hiding back there?" I could smell the booze on her breath from 3 feet away. My eyes darted to Miss Mortimer's circle, betraying me. To my horror, my mother picked up a pair of gym shorts from the floor and began to wipe the chalky symbols away. "It's just not enough that I bust my butt every day to pay for this stupid house, is it? Now you gotta go and draw all over it. Ungrateful, that's what you are. Just like your deadbeat father." "Stop!" I shouted, but I couldn't push past her in time. My path to Miss Mortimer's study had been completely wiped away. "Don't you dare talk back to me, mister. Now listen, I ordered us a pizza and we're gonna have dinner, like a normal family tonight, you understand. I've had enough of you skulking around up here." As she dragged me by the collar to the kitchen, all I could think about was the gloom in Miss Mortimer's study and the broken teapot on its rug. One way or another, I had to get back there. After my mother stomped off to bed alone and my father had passed out on the couch, I snuck into the oily darkness of the garage and fumbled around until I found a tin can full of sidewalk chalk. I carried it up to my bedroom and sat staring at the inside of my door, trying to recall Miss Mortimer's odd symbols. There had been one that looked like a tree with no leaves, 2 that were more like crows' footprints, a 4th with the appearance of a heart stabbed through with a spear. The final 2 were the hardest to draw. Just thinking about them made my head hurt. But 10 minutes later, I was pretty satisfied with the circle that I had redrawn on my door. It's true, it wasn't perfect, but I had to try something, didn't I? I took a deep breath, put my hand in the circle that I had drawn and pulled open the door. I wanted to cheer. I had done it. There was the study shrouded in darkness. The little brass lamp and the hot plate were both in place, but the shattered teapot was gone. I wondered if maybe Miss Mortimer had cleaned it up. That would mean that she was all right after all. I sprang through the door, sure that she would be proud of me for recreating her circle all by myself. My breath came out in a cloud of bluish white. It was cold in the study, and the floor felt wrong. Squishy almost, like it was made of human skin. I shuddered and reached out for the drawstring of the little brass lamp. When I turned it on, its bare bulb emitted an eerie greenish-blue glow. That wasn't all that was different either. I could now see that what I had thought was a pot was actually more like a cauldron. Greasy bones and hair floated in a coagulated soup. Instead of Miss Mortimer's vibrant collection of plants, stuffed crows and animal skulls lined the bookshelves. Their uncanny glass eyes seemed to follow me as I tiptoed across the weird, squishy floor. I wasn't sure why I was being so careful. Hadn't I always been a welcome guest in Miss Mortimer's house? Most disturbingly of all, there was a breeze in the study. Wheezing gusts of air that seemed to blow down from the ceiling. When I looked up, however, all I could see were layers and layers of something ragged hanging from the ceiling, a substance halfway between tattered cloth and spider webs. Like everything else in the dim light of the lamp, it had an awful bluish color that reminded me of dead things rotting underwater. I took a deep breath and kept walking forward. Up ahead, I saw an angular hallway that led to the rest of the house. I froze. The hallway hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. Was I even inside Miss Mortimer's study at all? I had been so excited to find her that I hadn't even considered the fact that I might now be somewhere very different. Somewhere very, very wrong. I could feel that weird, erratic breeze on the back of my neck. Smell it even. A cold reek like meat that had gone bad in the freezer. I spun and looked up for the second time, and I saw its source. It dragged its distended body toward me through the cobwebby rags with 8 spider-like limbs, each capped by a horribly human hand. Its face was a nightmare version of Miss Mortimer's, lanky brown hair, pupilless white eyes, a jaw that was opening wide enough to swallow me whole. "Run!" The voice of the real Miss Mortimer boomed in my head. It came out of nowhere, but it snapped me out of my paralysis. As I sprinted across the spongy ground, those awful hands grazed my hair and tangled in my shirt. Fabric ripped as I squirmed free and flung myself back through my bedroom door. I slammed it shut, but heard a hungry pounding from the other side. I hastily wiped away the less than perfect circle that I had drawn and scrambled backwards, breathing hard. Now I understood why Miss Mortimer had warned me to never ever alter the symbols around the circle, but I wasn't ready to give up. I would just have to find a different way into the house at the end of the street. It was strange to think that in all the years that I had known Miss Mortimer, I had never once entered her house through the front door. I felt like a trespasser as I crossed her overgrown lawn, looking for an unlocked door, a half-open window, anything that would allow access to the quiet little house at the end of the street. Outwardly, there was no sign that anything was wrong. I could see Miss Mortimer's study through the big bay window, and while it was dark and quiet, I was relieved to see that there were no signs of any cobweb rags or glass-eyed animal skulls. Circling around the house, I finally found what I was looking for, a cat flap in the back door. It was much too small for an adult, but at 9 years old, I was just scrawny enough to pull myself through. "Who goes there?" Miss Mortimer's voice boomed inside my head when I was halfway inside the cat flap. The air felt suddenly thicker, like invisible hands were pushing me back outside. It's just me," I cried out. Suddenly, I was pulled the rest of the way into the kitchen, but Miss Mortimer was nowhere in sight. I made a beeline for the half-open door to the study up ahead, and breathed a sigh of relief when everything in the cozy room was exactly as I had remembered. The plants on the bookshelves in need of watering, the shattered teapots on the floor. A hunch made me look on the other side of the door, where I found another chalk circle. My heart was in my throat when I put my hand inside of it and turned the doorknob, but it only led back to my bedroom. That gave me an idea. I grabbed Miss Mortimer's red notebook from where it lay on her desk, flipped to a blank page and copied down the symbols exactly. Now I had a way back to my room from anywhere else that I might need to go. At least, that's what I told myself. With the notebook and marker in hand, I searched the room for more clues to Miss Mortimer's disappearance. Several of those big old-fashioned books were missing, as well as the handmade broom that was usually hanging on the wall. Finally, I noticed it, a circle of symbols written in lipstick on the floor-to-ceiling mirror. Fascinated, I touched the center of the circle, and I felt the floor fall out from beneath my feet. I was falling through an empty sky, a sky the color of mirrored light. I crashed into something hard and reflective. It felt like some sort of curved bridge, very, very high up. I crawled on my hands and knees to the unprotected edge and I looked down. Arches, fractals, other forms that should have been impossible. Insane silver architecture stretched as far as I could see. A strong wind whipped gray clouds through the weirdly reflective sky, threatening to push me over the ledge. I pulled back from the dizzying drop and wiped my sweating palms on my jeans to remind myself that I wasn't dreaming. One false step and I wouldn't have to worry about how I was going to make it home. I crawled toward the cathedral tall corridor at the end of the bridge. I didn't dare to stand up until I was well inside of it. At least there were walls here, even if they were sort of mirror-like. I held the marker in Miss Mortimer's notebook to my chest like a protective amulet, telling myself not to be afraid, that I was fine, and that I could escape from this eerie, lifeless place at any time, provided that I had copied those symbols exactly right. I had written them down in a hurry, but I hadn't made any mistakes. At least I didn't think that I had. I realized that I was afraid to try and find out that I was wrong. I wanted to call out for Miss Mortimer, but the same instinct that had warned me to tiptoe in the spider thing's lair had warned me to be silent here. There was no sound but the wind wailing through the weird mirrorscape outside, and no movement but my own gloomy reflection. Or was there? I got the oddest feeling that when I stopped walking, my reflection didn't stop at exactly the same moment. Instead, it came ever so slightly closer. No, that was impossible. It was just a trick of the light caused by all the weird angles in this place. It had to be. The vast corridor was getting narrower and narrower. Soon my reflections were close enough to touch, if they were my reflections at all. I didn't remember my skin being so pale and colorless, or pulled so tightly across my skull. And my eyes weren't inky black either. I ran, my reflections ran too. They pressed their identical hands against the mirrored walls, their hunger deepening as they closed in around me. I felt sure that at any moment they would reach through and pull me into the endlessly reflected world on the other side. And then suddenly I was out. The narrow corridor opened into an enormous chamber strewn with wall-sized shards of an enormous broken mirror. And there in the center of it stood Miss Mortimer. "It's you," she spun to face me. Her old-fashioned black dress, wispy brown hair, and bright green eyes were exactly as I'd remembered. "How on earth did you find your way here?" I could have cried for joy. I had found her, the one adult that I trusted, who'd always been there for me. And then I glanced at the mirror shards around us. The creature reflected there was not Miss Mortimer. Its movements were the same as those of the woman reaching out to hug me, but that was where the similarity had ended. It was a starving, silver, faceless thing, with a mouthful of teeth as jagged as shattered glass. The horrible image grinned at me from every angle except one. I could see the real Miss Mortimer inside one of the shards, knocking desperately from inside it, trying to warn me. I slipped beneath the arms that reached out for me and ran to her. Miss Mortimer was pointing to something in my hand. Her red notebook. I pushed it up against Miss Mortimer's mirror and watched in amazement as it passed through to the other side. She flipped it open and recited some soundless words, and stepped back through the looking glass. The shard that had been holding her shattered, and the illusion dropped away from the ghastly thing in front of us. Miss Mortimer tossed me the notebook, and I knew right away what she wanted me to do. I hid behind a shard that was twice my height and began frantically scribbling the circle of symbols that could lead us home. Behind me came flashes of light and heat, cold and darkness. Miss Mortimer and the mirror monster fought each other with words that made my head ring and my nose bleed. I knew that they were speaking those strange symbols aloud, using them to bend reality somehow, what kids my age called magic. Meanwhile, I was busy trying to get us home. "It's done," I screamed over my shoulder. With the last symbol drawn, I placed my hand in the circle and felt myself being pulled through. Suddenly, I was flying into my bedroom, crashing onto the floor, and Miss Mortimer was right behind me. She got to her feet and brushed off her dress, exhausted but alive. Looking around my shabby bedroom, it would have been hard to believe that the nightmarish place we had just returned from had ever existed at all. If it weren't for the blood trickling out of my nostrils and the mirror dust in my hair. "What the heck's going on up there?" My father roared over the din of the television. "I just fell," Miss Mortimer replied in an uncannily perfect imitation of my voice. "Everything's fine." Idiot, clumsy kid. I heard my mother mutter from the bathroom where she was getting ready for a cocktail party. "Can't you do something about them?" I begged Miss Mortimer. "There are some things even I can't fix." She ruffled my hair and smiled sadly. Before I could stop her, she took the marker from my hand, opened her notebook, and copied a new set of symbols onto the back of my door. "After what happened on the other side of the mirror, the house at the end of the street isn't safe any longer. I'm afraid I'm leaving tonight for good." What? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After all I had gone through to put things back how they were, it wasn't fair. "But you just got back. Why?" "It's a long story. Shall I tell you on the way?" Miss Mortimer grinned. My jaw dropped. "Oh, you don't have to come along, of course. If you do, you'll be leaving this place and everyone in it behind forever. Even if you were to see them again, it would be like they had never known you. Are you sure that you can live with that?" Downstairs, I could hear the hum of my mother's hairdryer, my father crumpling a beer can and cursing when he missed his toss at the trash can. Miss Mortimer touched the circle of new symbols on the wall and looked back at me expectantly. "Well, what do you say?" I didn't say anything. I just grabbed Miss Mortimer's hand, and when she opened that door, I walked through with her to the other side. I had never been to the mirror realm before. Miss Mortimer was telling me. I didn't expect it to be so dangerous, and I certainly didn't expect you to have to come in there after me. We were sitting on the porch of a cottage, sipping lemonade. We had arrived the night before, and after the Midwest suburbs that I was used to, it felt like being inside of a fairy tale. The white walls were crisscrossed with timber beams that were wider than I was. The flagstone floor was worn smooth by ages of use. A fine layer of dust covered everything. I got the feeling that this place didn't belong to Miss Mortimer, but I kept my mouth shut about that. I was much more concerned with why we were on the run in the first place. The idea that there were things out there that even Miss Mortimer was afraid of, it chilled my blood. To be honest, I never wanted to be involved with any of this. It was my best friend Matilda who wanted to be a Miss Mortimer paused. Who wanted to walk through walls and things like that. I wanted to be a kindergarten teacher. Can you believe that? "So why didn't you?" I asked, leaning forward in the creaky porch swing. The things that Matilda was studying kept getting darker and more dangerous. I warned her that she was getting in over her head, but she didn't listen. In the end, she wound up in a very bad place and couldn't find her way back. That's what I was doing on the other side of the mirror. I was trying to reach her. "And are you going to keep trying?" "I think so, although there really isn't much hope of finding her now. It's a shame. If only the situation was reversed, I'm sure Matilda would have found me a long time ago." These things never came as naturally to me as they did to her. Miss Mortimer smiled sadly and looked out over the overgrown garden, a jungle of hyacinths, morning glories, and blackberry bushes. She clapped her hands together. "Now, let's get this place cleaned up." It was odd how Miss Mortimer knew exactly where to find the record player and jazz album that she wanted to play in this abandoned cottage, but I kept my mouth shut about that too. We beat the dust out of the mattresses, scrubbed tiles, and chopped a path through the garden, while scenery played in the background. We didn't finish until late afternoon. "I'm going to go into town to pick up some things that we need, but there's a creek at the bottom of the hill that you might enjoy exploring." She didn't have to tell me twice. As tired and sweaty as I was, the thought of splashing around in cool water sounded heavenly. I barely heard her warning about ticks and leeches as I ran through the tall grass toward the sound of water. The creek was shallow and fast and cold. It barely covered my ankles in most places, but I was able to find a pool beside a huge boulder that was deep enough to swim in. I rinsed my filthy clothes and left them to dry in the sun while I floated. Leaves rustled in the breeze overhead. My toes grazed against mossy rocks. I felt freer than I ever had in my life. "Who are you?" I sat up with a splash and nearly swallowed a lungful of water. A barefoot boy about my age stood staring at me with a confused expression on his face, like a rock had just fallen out of the sky and hit him between the eyes. Where had he come from? "I'm Eddie." I made up the name on the spot. He had to think about it. "Johan." He's lying. I spun with a start. A gap-toothed girl with rough-cut blonde pigtails was perched on a rock behind me, so close that I could almost touch her. So what if he's lying? I would rather hang out with a liar than have to stare at your ugly mug all day, Abigail. The boy who had spoken was hanging dangerously by his knees from a tree branch right above me. I couldn't believe it. I hadn't heard them all approaching. "I'm Ted, by the way. The guy with the face is Johan, and the girl with no teeth is Abigail." "I do so have teeth," Abigail shrieked. "They're just growing in." "Shh, keep your voice down." Johan looked around fearfully. Seconds later, a shadow swooped by overhead. It might have just been a bird, but if it was the biggest bird that I had ever seen. The three of them stood still watching and didn't resume speaking until it was gone. "I'm sorry if we startled you." Johan offered a hand to help me out of the water. "We're just not used to seeing other kids down here." I took his hand and also my clothes, which I quickly put on in the shadows behind the boulder. "There's a big waterfall further down the creek," Johan went on. "You want to see?" We had so much fun together that I had lost track of time, and before I knew it, the sun had set and the water had become icy cold. "I gotta go," I stammered. "See you guys around." "Of course," Johan replied. The confused look had returned to his face. Where else would we be? "One thing though," Ted piped up. "Don't tell anyone you saw us down here. If you do, there could be trouble. Big trouble." Abigail nodded solemnly. I nodded. I understood that. There would have been heck to pay if my parents had caught me sneaking on the street to Miss Mortimer's or playing in some dirty creek. That's why when Miss Mortimer asked me how my day had been over dinner, I just told her that it was fine. The creek was pretty and that I had checked myself for ticks and I didn't find any. If the three odd children that I had met were dangerous or important in any way, I was sure that she would have told me. But did she even know about them? What was this place really? What did it mean to Miss Mortimer? No matter how many different ways I asked, I could never get a straight answer. Looking back, those late spring days all seemed to blend together. Miss Mortimer would give me lessons or chores in the morning. In the afternoon, I was ordered outside to play while she carried on her search for Matilda. I wasn't sure what exactly that entailed, but it was dangerous enough that she wanted me far away from the cottage while she was doing it. So I went down to the creek to play with my new friends. Johan, Abigail, and Ted welcomed me open-heartedly to their games and inside jokes. But as the days rolled by, I realized that there was a lot that they weren't telling me. Why, for example, did they always wear the same clothes? Why did they know so little about current events in the world outside the woods? And most importantly, what were they so afraid of? My new friends went out of their way to avoid certain areas of the forest in certain times of day. If they heard a loud sound in the underbrush or if a shadow passed over the sun, they abandoned their play and hid. Once, the three of them ducked behind a log to avoid a single deer. I thought they were being silly, until I noticed how strangely the deer was acting. It walked purposefully through the ferns, moving its head from side to side, just like a person searching for something. Its eyes, too, were blue and oddly human. I shivered. "Do you think it saw us?" Abigail whispered after it passed. "Don't think so," Ted shrugged, but there was doubt in his voice. We probably ought to go back early today, though, just to be safe." "Where do you guys live anyway?" I asked. "Over yonder." Johann gestured up the hill on the other side of the creek. "There used to be the 5 of us, but Livy and Taylor got caught." "What do you mean caught?" I groaned, sick of all the secrecy. "What is going on around here?" A raven flapped up from its perch on a nearby tree and we all jumped. "We must be on our way." Johann frowned. "Farewell." The 3 of them walked up the hill, shadowy figures backlit by a fiery orange and eerie sunset. The next afternoon, none of my friends were at the creek. I waited for almost an hour before heading up the hill in the rough direction that Johann had indicated. A sense of dread had tightened my chest, and I didn't notice how oddly quiet the woods had become. Finally, I burst out of the tree into a wide clearing. I looked around for a house, but all I found was an old cemetery. Had I gone the wrong way somehow? I climbed onto the flagstone wall to get my bearings, and as I did, I chanced to look down at one of these skewed, mossy gravestones. Johann Menefee, 1866 to 1874. It was a coincidence, it had to be. But when I examined the other headstones, I found them all. Abigail Callahan, 1904 to 1910. Ted Powell, 1949 to 1956. Rest in peace. Psst, someone whispered. Ted was standing at the edge of the woods. I noticed with a chill that his bare feet left no footprints on the muddy ground. From his weird slang to his pompadour haircut and funny-looking jeans, it all made sense. I backed away. You're dead," I muttered. "That don't matter now," he hissed. "Oh, what? You think being dead makes you safe? We almost got caught and..." Ted's eyes suddenly went wide with fear. "Hide." A shadowy shape closed in behind him. I crouched, pressing myself against the graveyard wall. Through the gap in the flagstone, I watched the pale, long-fingered hands reach out of the gloom and wrap around Ted's neck. A horrible, rasping voice echoed through the silent woods. "Gotcha." Through the crack in the graveyard wall, I could see clearly what had grabbed Ted. It was ageless and genderless, its skin as pale as the harvest moon. Whether the dark rags it was wrapped in were cloth, skins, or both, I couldn't say. Its proportions were stretched and wrong, but its dark blue eyes were human. Ted's legs kicked the air uselessly as the pale thing's jaw distended, lowering down past its chest. I held my friend just above the toothless black pit of its wide-open mouth, and swallowed him whole. I clamped a hand over my mouth to hold down a scream. The thing folded its freakishly long fingers over its distended belly and belched. A little bit of color, a little bit of life, seemed to flow back into its dead-looking skin. "Does anything taste so wonderful as the soul of a frightened child?" it asked the silent forest. "Surely not." It paused, sniffing the air. "Oh, there's a live one around here somewhere." To my horror, it began walking toward me, its rags whispering as they dragged through the grass. There you are among the tombstones. Come on out, little one, there's no point in hiding now." My blood ran cold. How had it known where I was? Trembling, I got to my feet. "If you come quietly, it'll be over before you know it." The thing's voice was insidious. It seemed to come from all directions, wriggling into my ears like a wicked worm. Otherwise, I might have to turn into a raven and peck out your eyes, or a wolf to slurp up your scrawny pink guts, or a deer to stomp you under my hooves. Would you like that?" As it spoke, it transformed into the animals that it described and then into a hideous combination of all three. All the while, its dark blue eyes observed me, waiting to see what I would do. I suddenly realized that it wanted me to run. It wanted me to panic and flee the graveyard because it couldn't come inside itself. "You can't come in here," I said, more to myself than to the prowling thing beyond the wall. "I don't know why, but you can't." The pale, almost human thing flew at me. It came as close as it could get to the other side of the cemetery wall, but it didn't cross it. "You can't stay in there forever, little one. Sooner or later you'll have to drink and eat. You might as well get it over with." "People are looking for me. They know where I am." I shouted and realized that it was half true. If I wasn't home by sunset, Miss Mortimer would notice that I was missing. She would come for me and then she would deal with this monster. "That's fine, little one. Wonderful, in fact. I'll just eat them too. But if you do as I ask, I won't hurt your friends." The thing pressed its face against the invisible barrier that separated us and opened its toothless maw impossibly wide. Its breath smelled like death. And doubt clouded my heart. Would Miss Mortimer really be able to defeat this thing, which could devour souls and transform into wild animals? I hoped she could, but I wasn't sure. The sun sank lower in the sky. The thing's shadow stretched behind it, long and vulture-like. I looked helplessly around for a way out of my predicament, but I saw none. Meanwhile, this thing kept on whispering. Its awful insinuations were getting harder and harder to ignore. The air cooled. The dusk bathed the hilltop cemetery in purple light. I was just beginning to wonder if Miss Mortimer was coming for me after all, when I heard her calling my name. The thing's mouth twisted into a nightmarish imitation of a smile. It waved its hand and spoke an impossible word. A ripple passed through the air. "Miss Mortimer," I shouted. "Hey, Miss Mortimer! Eliza, I'm up here!" I yelled and jumped, but Miss Mortimer just kept walking through the woods, looking from side to side and calling my name. "She can't see or hear us," the thing sneered. "She can't even see the graveyard. To her, this is just a grassy hilltop. Don't you see, little one? You've only made things worse for yourself." The thing was lying, it had to be. I waved and screamed myself hoarse, but it didn't make any difference. Just as it had said, Miss Mortimer walked past the cemetery as though it wasn't even there. And then she was gone, just another shadow in the forest. The moon rose through the sky, but the pale thing didn't move. It just stared at me like a buzzard waiting for its prey to die. I sat down and cried. Maybe the thing was right. Maybe I should just get it over with. A pebble flew out from the woods and clattered beside me, and then another. I glimpsed two moonlit familiar faces among the trees. Johann and Abigail. They could see me. The pale monstrosity in front of me noticed my excitement. It looked around suspiciously, and I knew that I didn't have much time. "Miss Mortimer, Miss Eliza Mortimer, who lives in the cottage across the creek. Won't you come and help me? I know you would if you knew where I was," I called in a sing-song voice. Johann and Abigail looked at each other and nodded to me and slunk away into the forest. They had gotten the message. "No one can help you, little one, no one," the thing rasped. I crossed my arms smugly. "That's what you think." When Miss Mortimer hadn't appeared in a few hours, my confidence began to fade. Johann and Abigail had always been scared of adults, and after seeing the horror that stalked through their woods, I could understand why. But what if they were afraid of Miss Mortimer too? What if they couldn't reach her for some reason? The eastern sky was growing brighter when I saw a second dark figure approaching through the woods. A torch made of funny-smelling herbs burnt in its hand, and Johann and Abigail walked behind it, leaving no trace of their passage. It was Miss Mortimer. In the cold morning light, her face was almost as pale as my captor's. She waved the smoking bundle and another ripple passed through the air. Her eyes went wide. She could see me. "You came," I cried out, relieved. But Miss Mortimer wasn't smiling. "Let him go, Matilda," she ordered the pale thing in front of me. It whipped around to face her, its dark blue eyes full of recognition and hate. "Who are you to command me, Eliza?" Like a bird of prey unfurling its wings, the monster called Matilda drew itself up to its full height. It was almost twice as tall as Miss Mortimer, but she didn't back down. "Don't tell me you think that little stick of sage will keep you safe." Matilda laughed, and its laughter became a wind that made its rags whip around. It drove clouds across the pre-dawn sky and snuffed the smoldering herbs in Miss Mortimer's hand. The darkness deepened. "I searched everywhere for you," Miss Mortimer murmured. "I studied those old books of yours, learned your ways. I never imagined that I would find you back here of all places." "It is here that I left this world, and it is here that I return to it. Time has no meaning in the places I've been. Do you know what I had to do to survive there, Eliza? Do you know what I had to do to come back?" "I can't even imagine. But the soul of that little boy, Matilda. How could you? How many others were there? How many more will there be?" Miss Mortimer's hands had balled into fists, and I was surprised to see tears in her eyes. The person that I loved would never have stolen the lives of others just to stay alive herself. As Miss Mortimer spoke, I noticed that Matilda's hands were moving. Those long pale fingers extracted something from inside those ragged sleeves, something like a small brass dart. "Look out, she's got something," I screamed, but my shout died in my throat as Matilda spun and hurled the dart into my chest. "No!" Miss Mortimer ran to me, Johann and Abigail at her heels. The last thing I saw before my vision faded was a great black bird taking flight beside the cemetery gate. "Are you too sure you want to do this? If you do, there's no going back." Time had passed, I couldn't have said how much. Miss Mortimer's voice sounded distant, as though I was deep underwater. I was lying in my bed back in the cottage, but how strange, I couldn't move. I couldn't feel anything, not even my own breath. Was I? Miss Mortimer had made a ring around me with some kind of colored powder. Her red notebook was open in front of her, and to her right, Johann and Abigail stood holding hands. "Well, sure," Abigail nodded. "I was getting bored with the creek anyway. I reckon it was about time I moved on too, and if it helps out our friend." "All right then, if you're ready." Miss Mortimer nodded and then wrinkled her brow. I knew that look. That was the one that meant, "I really hope this works." She began to chant. As she did, Johann and Abigail became brighter and brighter until they seemed to be made of light. They reached out to touch my chest, and their light dimmed and then disappeared. I felt a loud, sudden pounding inside my chest. It took me a minute to realize that it was my own heartbeat. "Johann, Abigail, your friends have moved on." Miss Mortimer leaned over and brushed my sweat-soaked hair away from my forehead. "I don't know if they're happier where they are now, but I would like to think so." "And Matilda," I whispered. Gone. For now. But I don't think this place is safe any longer. It's a shame. We had such happy memories here. A shadow passed over Miss Mortimer's face. This life on the road is turning out to be more dangerous than I thought. There's still so much that I don't understand. You know, you might be better off back with your parents. No, I shook my head. I don't care if it's dangerous, I'm coming with you. Miss Mortimer tried to hide her smile without much success. I tried to get out of bed, but I slid backwards immediately. Matilda's poisoned dart had left me as weak as a newborn. Miss Mortimer took out a small piece of chalk and placed it in my hand. Rest. We'll be back on the road again before you know it. The chalk circle that took us out of Matilda's cottage was the last bit of magic that I saw Miss Mortimer perform for a long time. When we stepped through it, I found myself standing in a Roman palace. I was surrounded by statues of emperors, marble columns, and slot machines. I had never been to Las Vegas before. I had no idea such a place even existed. Matilda and I came here for my 21st birthday, Miss Mortimer explained, a little sheepishly. It was the only other place that I could think of to go. Surrounded by so much light and sound, it was odd how our lives seemed to quiet down, at least for a while. Miss Mortimer rented a small apartment for us, enrolled me in the local public school system, and got herself a job as a para-educator in the same elementary school that I attended. She claimed it was just a coincidence, but if so, there were a lot of coincidences that summer. Like the way the school secretary's eyes slid out of focus anytime he asked Miss Mortimer for a document that she didn't have, or the way the apartment rental agent spoke only to her, like he didn't see me at all, and looking back, maybe he really didn't. I suspected that Miss Mortimer got a job in my school to keep an eye on me. After all, Matilda was still out there. Miss Mortimer and I made a pact not to use the W word, but the fact was that Matilda was a far more accomplished witch than Miss Mortimer had ever been. Could she track us somehow, maybe using a stray hair from my head or a few drops of blood from the dart that she had thrown at me? Neither of us had any idea, but I had a feeling that Miss Mortimer was secretly working to find out. She had had all her books and furniture shipped to our new apartment, and if I ignored the red dirt, cacti, and scorching asphalt outside the window, the living room felt just like her study back in my old neighborhood. Miss Mortimer herself seemed happy to be working with kids, just like she had always wanted. But the light in her room often stayed on until after midnight, and a few of her books never reappeared on their shelf. She was studying something, but what? Once I pressed my ear to her door and listened to the words she kept repeating to herself over and over, and then crept back to my bedroom and tried to speak them myself. The first few times nothing happened. On my fourth try, 3 of my fingers burnt painfully and gave off an awful smell like rotten eggs that lingered even after I had plunged them into cold water. The next morning, Miss Mortimer raised an eyebrow on my blackened fingers but said nothing. What was going on? On one hand, I felt guilty for violating Miss Mortimer's privacy. On the other, I felt left out, especially after all we had been through together. When I snooped around her room while she was at a training, however, I found more than I bargained for. The wall was covered with "Have you seen me?" flyers for missing children, all linked by red string. I realized with a chill that the disappearances were probably Matilda's doing, and my face could have just as easily been pinned to her board beside the others. And that wasn't all. There was also a foul-smelling book written in what I would later learn was backwards Latin. A post-it note with "Thin Times, Thin Places" scribbled on it, and a calendar counting down to Halloween, which by then was just a few days away. The Halloweens that I had always known featured chilly nights, swirling autumn leaves, and packs of children on the prowl for candy. It turned out that Halloweens in Las Vegas were a lot hotter, a lot brighter, and a lot less kid-friendly. Miss Mortimer and I spent the evening inside scaring ourselves with old movies, and when I went to bed, I thought that she did too. But around midnight, I heard the apartment door creaking open. Miss Mortimer was trying to go someplace silently, and she wasn't using the chalk. She didn't want me to be able to follow her. Of course, I wasn't going to let that stop me. I watched out the window to see which direction she had turned and then headed down into the street. Miss Mortimer turned right, walking out towards the undeveloped desert lots. I frowned. There was nothing out there, not even light. Or so I had thought. As we left the sidewalk and went deeper into the desert night, a building began to take shape out of the darkness. A hotel. I had never seen one there before, but how could I have missed something so big and gaudy? Thin times, thin places, Miss Mortimer's note had said. In spite of the heat, I suddenly felt cold. No cars were parked in front of the hotel and no people stood on the sidewalk. There was nothing around but the blackness of the desert night. And when I turned around, I realized with horror that the city lights behind me were gone as well. It was as if apart from the building in front of me, the rest of the world had ceased to exist. Paradiso read the crimson neon lights, and I hurried to keep up as Miss Mortimer disappeared through the revolving beneath them. I had wanted to stay far enough away that she wouldn't see me, but the night around me had begun to feel oddly and horribly hungry. Maybe the darker than dark shapes in the darkness were just shadows cast by desert cliffs, but maybe not. And was that howling sound the wind or someone wailing? I didn't want to find out, and I didn't wait. I scampered into the hotel lobby and hid beneath an enormous ebony pillar. To my surprise, the marble lobby was empty and silent. A gaunt, hollowed-faced man in a black suit and red tie sat behind a round desk, still as a statue. The air was full of that burning rotten egg smell that I had noticed back in the apartment. I tiptoed through the shadows of the lobby, too eager to eavesdrop on Miss Mortimer's conversation with the thin man to wonder about the odd way my footsteps echoed in the cavernous space. Now that I was closer, I could read the nameplate on the thin man's desk. Kieran. It was hard to hear what they were saying with all the gibbering and jiggling that seemed to come from the shadows around me, but it was something about reservations. Miss Mortimer said that she didn't have one but wanted to make one. The thin man raised an eyebrow. If she wanted to make herself a reservation here, he said, she would need to speak with his superiors. The thin man gestured to the elevators behind him. A brass plaque above them read, "Abandoned all hope. Ye who enter here." It didn't seem like a very cheerful message for a hotel. The elevator doors opened in front of Miss Mortimer. I had only seconds to follow her. The thin man at the desk watched with silent curiosity as I skidded into the elevator behind Miss Mortimer just as the door was closing. "What on earth are you doing here?" "I followed you. I thought you might need help." Miss Mortimer pinched the bridge of her nose, took a deep breath, and counted to 10. "Just stay close to me and promise me something. If I squeeze your hand twice, run as fast as you can and don't look back." And then suddenly we were moving. There were 9 floors, I realized, and someone on the second floor had summoned the elevator. To my surprise, we were going down instead of up. Miss Mortimer grabbed my hand, backed us both against the mirrored walls of the elevator, and pressed a finger to her lips. The doors opened. Iron gray clouds whipped by on the other side, driven by a wind so strong that we had to grab onto the banister of the elevator to avoid being ripped out into the storm. There was no ceiling, no floor, nothing but an endless gale. I thought that I saw arms, legs, the bare skin of someone's back, but that was impossible. No people could survive out there. Could they? "Close your eyes," Miss Mortimer whispered. Seconds later, I heard it. Clomp, clomp. Not footsteps, hooves. Something had walked out of the raging winds and into the elevator, and that rotten smell was now stronger than ever. "Going down?" Miss Mortimer asked politely. The response was a bullish snort that seemed to mean yes, and then we were moving again 3 floors lower. Miss Mortimer scooted me slowly along the wall, partially to avoid the huge, foul-smelling presence, and partly to protect us from whatever we would find outside the doors when they opened once more. Even sheltered by the thick elevator walls, the heat was almost unbearable. Burning screams, the clang of metal. With a satisfied snort, whatever was sharing the elevator with us stomped out into the fire and the doors slid shut again. For a moment there was no sound but our ragged breaths and the dripping of our own sweat. Miss Mortimer pressed another button and we went down 1 more floor to our final destination. "You can open your eyes now," she told me. A square stone corridor waited outside. After everything I had seen and heard so far, its very stillness and quiet were unsettling. Our footsteps echoed eerily as we walked out into it. There were square gaps in the floor and ceiling, and I realized dizzily that there were more corridors that extended up and down for it felt like forever. And come to think of it, this hallway didn't have an end that I could see either, and neither did any of the others that we passed. I looked nervously back at the brass elevator and bit my lip. What was this place? What if we got lost? The corridors were lined with square metal doors. Some of them seemed to give off heat, others icy cold. Shrieks, moans, and even insane laughter came from the other side of the blind metal. Miss Mortimer took a few supplies out of her handbag. A silver dish, a stick, clear water, and an earring that I recognized from the cottage. It must have belonged to Matilda. She poured the water into the dish and placed the stick inside, with the earring on its tip. When she held her hand over the strange compass she had made, it began to spin, pointing a path down those endless hallways. And we walked until my feet felt like lead bricks. We turned more times than I could count. Finally, the compass stood still, even though the metal door in front of us was no different from the rest. To my surprise, Miss Mortimer opened it with just a gentle push. "These doors only open one way," she sighed. "The things inside these rooms are locked up and forgotten, unless somebody comes to let them out again." I wanted to ask Miss Mortimer why we were about to release something that had been imprisoned in this nightmarish place, but the tomb-like room in front of us was empty, at least as far as I could see. Miss Mortimer splashed some water through the doorway and it burst into flames. "It's probably best if you wait here." I held my breath and watched as Miss Mortimer crossed the threshold, approached a coffin-shaped altar in the center of the room, and picked up a yellowed scroll. I could see by the look on her face that we needed to get out of there fast. She slipped the paper into the folds of her black dress, grabbed my hand and took a right down the next hallway. To my surprise, another elevator was waiting for us. "What's going on?" I whispered. Miss Mortimer shushed me as we went into the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. As the floors blinked by, I kept my fingers crossed there wouldn't be any stops, that we wouldn't encounter any more of the awful things that dwelt in this place, and that whatever Miss Mortimer had just done, she wouldn't get caught. When the doors of the lobby opened, my sigh of relief died in my throat. At first I wasn't sure what I was looking at. If the 3 men standing in the lobby had their backs to me, why was I looking at their faces? The answer was as sickening as it was obvious. Their heads were turned around completely backwards. Black oily tears had blinded their eyes, but somehow I knew that they were staring at Miss Mortimer. One of them started to moan, raising a backwards facing hand towards where the squirrel was hidden in Miss Mortimer's dress. That was when she squeezed my hand twice. We ran for it, although in my mind I felt more like we flew. As we raced for the door, the facade of the lobby fell away all around us, giving way to darkness and the gnashing of teeth. With a sinking feeling, I realized that this was not a hotel. It never had been. It was just the form that my mind had given it to make sense of its infinite horror and insanity. Abandon all hope, ye who enter here. Up ahead, an enormous black gate carved with maddening images was closing, cutting off our escape, but not fast enough. We slipped through the gap and out the revolving door before crashing, exhausted and into the red dirt of the desert. When we turned around, Paradiso was gone. The light of dawn was just beginning to creep over the desert cliffs. Miss Mortimer pulled the yellowed scroll from her dress. "What is that thing?" "Matilda's contract." Miss Mortimer smiled sadly. "This is where she signed away her soul to escape that horrible place. This is what made her a monster that fuels itself by eating the spirits of the dead. If we destroy this, she'll go back to how she was before," I finished excitedly. "And the spirits that she consumed will be set free." Miss Mortimer nodded. She poured more water into the silver dish and spread the scroll across it. And as she did, the ancient paper began to smoke and finally dissolve. When it was nothing but mush, she poured it out into the sand and stomped on it. We walked back to our apartment on the outskirts of the city, too tired to speak. Miss Mortimer unlocked the door and I stepped through after her, but then someone else stepped through after me. I gasped and backed against the wall as a pale woman threw her arms around Miss Mortimer in a tight and joyful hug. I had no idea who she was at first, and then I recognized her dark blue eyes.